Bread can be ordinary, and yet it has toppled great empires in moments. The first sentences you hear should feel like a paradox, because simple food has repeatedly become a weapon of history. The smell of baked bread has been a promise of order and safety in many cities. When that promise vanished, the sound of footsteps in those same streets was the sound of revolution beginning to breathe. Hunger is not merely a private suffering. Hunger becomes a public accusation. When markets fail to deliver affordable food, people begin to question the legitimacy of those who govern. Food scarcity concentrates anger in a concrete object that everyone understands and values. It converts abstract grievances into a visceral demand for loaf and justice. Across medieval Europe, bread riots were among the earliest recorded mass protests. These outbreaks usually began at dawn with a crowd, and ended by noon with smashed loaves and broken windows. Medieval communities relied on local mills and seasonal harvests, making them vulnerable to weather and war. When harvests failed, the most basic contracts of life dissolved into open, dangerous unrest. Food riots in early modern Europe followed similar patterns yet grew larger and more organized. Crowds demanded price controls, punished grain hoarders, and sometimes seized supplies to feed entire neighborhoods. Authorities often responded with a mix of brutality and concession, alternating between hangings and grain price freezes. Those choices shaped politics for decades and sometimes accelerated the formation of modern states. France experienced a decisive chapter in the politics of bread during the late 18th century. The state had tried reforms, but the markets moved faster than policy, and by 1775 there were open flour wars across the countryside. Small towns where women and workers marched to bakeries and mills became the testing ground for anger that would later eclipse the monarchy. Each seized cart and shouted slogan tightened the noose around a fragile, ancient rodguy. By 1789, bread shortages in Paris had turned into a political emergency no policy could ignore. Prices for grain soared while wages stagnated, and a loaf that used to be affordable suddenly became a luxury for many families. Lines at bakeries lengthened into lines at national assemblies as people demanded not just a loaf but representation. The relationship between food access and political legitimacy became impossible to ignore. The storming of the Bastille was not solely about prisons and symbols. It was part of a larger breakdown in supply and trust. Everyday survival had become contested terrain, and that contest birthed revolutionary fervor. When a government cannot consistently feed its people, the social contract begins to erode as quickly as bread disappears from shelves. Revolutions in this context look less like abstract uprisings and more like reclamations of daily dignity. Not every bread riot becomes a revolution, but every revolution has often begun with unmet hunger. Food scarcity acts like dry tinder around a city's combustible grievances, waiting for a spark to ignite mass action. Small food protests can cascade into political crises when they reveal broader failures in governance and distribution. Those cascades are what historians trace when they map a path from breadlines to barricades. The 19th century introduced industrialization and urbanization, changing how food crises unfolded across Europe. Cities drew millions into dense neighborhoods where a single bad harvest could ripple into mass hunger overnight. Industrial laborers depended on steady wages to buy food, creating a direct political link between the factory floor and the dinner table. When wages failed or prices spiked, those urban networks mobilized quickly and loudly. Colonial empires complicated the politics of food by redirecting local harvest toward global markets. Colonized regions sometimes produced enough food, yet local populations still starved because crops were exported for profit. This export-driven scarcity generated famines and uprisings in places that had previously been self-sustaining. The politics of distribution became inseparable from the politics of domination and resistance. Fast forward to the 21st century and the logic remains hauntingly familiar despite technological advances. Food price spikes in 2007, 2002, 2008, and again around 2010 and 2011 produced waves of unrest across multiple continents. Globalized supply chains spread shocks rapidly and unevenly, turning localized harvest failures into international crises. Those shocks revealed how fragile our modern food systems can be when markets and politics collide. The Arab Spring revealed the modern face of food-driven unrest in surprising detail and speed. While political factors were central, rising food prices and high unemployment formed a combustible backdrop for protests across North Africa and the Middle East. The image of a fruit vendor setting himself on fire became a symbol that fused personal humiliation with systemic failure. That act triggered protests that were fed by a mix of hunger, dignity, and decades of unaddressed grievances. Economists point to the FAO Food Price Index as a useful but incomplete predictor of unrest. Spikes in that index have correlated with riots because sudden price inflation undermines household budgets and social patience. Yet correlation is not a single cause explanation, and local governance, social media, and unemployment all mediate whether price shocks become protests. Food is the match, but there must also be fuel and oxygen for the fire to spread. Government responses to food crises fall into predictable categories that are ancient and modern at once. Authorities may choose suppression, price controls, rationing, subsidies, or open markets, and each option carries political consequences. Brute force can temporarily silence crowds but rarely resolve shortages sustainably, and price controls can relieve pain but cause long-term supply issues. The political calculus is always messy because every response creates winners and losers. Subsidies and food assistance can stabilize societies if they are well-targeted and adequately funded by transparent institutions. When subsidies are stolen, misallocated, or financed by debt, they create deferred crises rather than solutions. Effective safety nets require trust in institutions and competent logistics to reach the most vulnerable. Without that trust, food aid becomes another arena for political contestation and patronage. Trade restrictions and export bans are common short-term responses that often backfire globally. A country that restricts grain exports to secure domestic supply can drive up prices on the global market and harm import-dependent neighbors. These actions reveal the tension between short-term political survival and long-term global cooperation in food systems. They also show how interconnected scarcity has become in a deeply globalized world. Climate change introduces another complex variable to the politics of food security and social stability. Extreme weather, shifting precipitation patterns, and warming seas can all reduce crop yields and disrupt storage and transport. Those environmental pressures increase the probability that price shocks will recur and spread across regions. Politically fragile states are especially vulnerable to these compounded stresses, risking cycles of unrest and instability. Conflict and war exacerbate food insecurity by destroying infrastructure, displacing farmers, and cutting off access to markets. The recent global shocks around grain supply show how a localized conflict can cascade into worldwide consequences. When supply routes and ports are closed, food prices and hunger rise even in faraway cities that never expected to be affected. Those linkages make food a strategic asset and a dangerous vulnerability in modern geopolitics. Urbanization changes the social calculus of hunger because cities rely on purchased food, rather than local harvests. Urban residents are politically potent because they gather in concentrated numbers and can quickly block trade routes. A single day without affordable bread in a crowded metropolis can produce disruptions that ripple through industries and administrations alike. Urban food insecurity therefore often accelerates political destabilization faster than rural shortages. The politics of food distribution are often hidden behind technical jargon and policy papers. But at the human level, distribution decisions decide who eats today and who waits until tomorrow, shaping loyalties and grievances. Distribution systems that prioritize elites, cities, or exports can leave rural and marginalized communities chronically hungry. That inequity becomes political fuel when people start blaming institutions rather than seasons. Food security policy therefore needs to be read as both economics and moral choice by any government. Investing in storage, local markets, and resilient supply chains reduces volatility and protects the social contract in lean years. Social investments in agriculture, infrastructure, and emergency response are not charity but political insurance. Nations that build resilient systems buy time, credibility, and stability for their populations and leaders alike. Technology offers tools to mitigate risk, but cannot replace good governance or fair distribution. Remote sensing, data analytics, and improved logistics help predict shortages, but they must be paired with political will for meaningful impact. When technology is used merely to optimize extraction rather than equitable distribution, it amplifies inequality instead of reducing it. The moral design of technological systems matters at least as much as their technical specs. Corruption and patronage distort food systems by channeling resources to political allies rather than the most vulnerable. In many crises, the difference between order and chaos is whether institutions are perceived as fair and competent. When citizens believe distribution is rigged, every supermarket shortage becomes evidence of betrayal rather than misfortune. That perception can be more destabilizing than the actual scale of scarcity. Social movements and grassroots networks often step into the breach when states fail to act effectively. Community kitchens, urban gardens, and mutual aid networks can provide immediate relief and rebuild trust in local action. These grassroots responses also transform crisis into civic learning, creating practices that can outlast the emergency. They remind us that food politics are as much about cooperation as they are about conflict. Understanding history helps us see that food-driven unrest is not random but patterned and preventable in many instances. Governments that ignore history repeat mistakes, while those that learn can diffuse crises before they explode into violence. The historical record teaches that timely transparency, targeted aid, and fair distribution reduce the risk that scarcity becomes revolution. Those lessons are urgent because the next spike could come faster than we expect. There is a moral paradox at the heart of food politics. Abundance can coexist with starvation. Modern economies can produce enough calories globally while millions remain hungry because distribution and access fail socially and politically. This paradox forces a deeper question about priorities and power than any single harvest can answer. If the world can feed billions and chooses not to fairly distribute food, unrest becomes a predictable moral indictment. Looking forward, climate disruption, geopolitical tension, and inequality create a dangerous convergence for food security and political stability. Each factor individually strains systems, and together they increase the likelihood of violent social ruptures. The policy choice before leaders is stark. Invest in resilient, fair food systems now, or face repeated waves of unrest that will be harder and costlier to manage later. The stakes are political because they are existential for millions. The politics of food distribution ultimately reflect deeper narratives about worth, citizenship, and authority in any society. When people feel excluded from the table, they stop believing in abstract institutions and start making their own remedies in the streets. History shows that protests over bread are protests about belonging and dignity as much as they are about economics. Those protests rewrite political relationships in ways that echo across generations. There is no technical silver bullet that will prevent every bread riot or political implosion, but building resilience, transparency, and fairness into food systems reduces the probability that shortages become revolutions. Policy choices matter because they structure who is protected during scarcity and who is exposed to failure. Those choices will determine whether future histories describe compassionate governance or collapsing markets. If history offers a final lesson, it is this: food is both a basic need and a profound political symbol. When supply meets dignity, societies are stable. When supply undermines dignity, revolt is the predictable response. The next generation confronting scarcity will judge leaders not by speeches, but by whether they secured the loaf on the table. That moral test will be the defining political challenge of our century. We began this story with a torn loaf and a silhouette of a crowd because food can make or unmake a society. That image returns to remind us that everyday objects can carry extraordinary political weight. If this exploration gave you a new perspective on the fragile politics of food, consider subscribing for more historical essays and modern analysis. The next time you watch a baker knead dough, remember that sometimes history is made at the breakfast table. Outro. Remember that food security is not merely a technical issue for experts and economists. It is a moral, political, and practical test for every community and leader in the modern world. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe and join a conversation about history, policy, and the shared responsibilities that keep societies fed and peaceful. Thank you for watching, and consider sharing this with someone who cares about how the next loaf will be won or lost.